So today's webinar is about using the contrast tool to specify your impact design and analyses. Today's presenters are members of the first in the world evaluation TA team from Apt Associates, Barbara Goodson and me, Ann Wolf. We'll be taking turns as we go through the presentation, so when you hear a different voice, that will be Barbara. In today's webinar, you will learn about the contrast tool, which is a resource to help you plan, track, and report impact study findings. You'll find out how the contrast tool is organized and how to use it by going through examples of completed sections of the contrast tool to illustrate how it's used. In this first section, we're going to provide an overall introduction to the contrast tool, its uses, how it works, and how you can access a copy for your own use. So what is the contrast tool? The contrast tool is an Excel spreadsheet with a set of interactive worksheets that are developed primarily to help evaluators plan out their impact analyses with sufficient detail that it really can function as an analysis plan. It's called the contrast tool because it's designed to help you outline and keep track of the contrasts or comparisons between the treatment and comparison group that you'll be examining to test the intervention's effectiveness. The tool also provides a template for reporting the results from your impact analyses. And it is not design dependent, so you can use it for RCTs, QEDs, pre-post designs, and for planning your even regression discontinuity designs. So when is the contrast tool useful? It's useful in all the stages of an evaluation. At the design stage, the tool can be used to pre-specify key research questions and plan each of the relevant impact analyses to address those questions. The tool guides you in specifying the key elements of your planned evaluation. And the tool was developed with the WWC standards in mind. So when you're using it, it helps you remain aware of the WWC standards so that you are thinking of that as you're designing your study and design a study that will hopefully meet WWC standards. At the analysis stage, the tool functions as an analysis plan, guiding you to conduct the planned analyses. At the reporting stage, the tool can be used to organize the reporting of findings. The contrast tool guides you through the information that should be reported about impacts, attrition, baseline equivalence, and representativeness, and it helps you organize that information so you can include it in a final report or article. Oops. Pardon me while my buttons are not perfectly responsive. And now, where can you find the contrast tool? It's available on the IES Evaluation TA website. It can be downloaded from there for your use. So how does the contrast tool work? It has 10 linked tabs or worksheets. The first set of 5 tabs are used for planning your analyses. In the first 4 tabs, you can specify the research questions, the outcomes that will be included in your analyses, the baseline measures, and the treatment and comparison samples that will be compared in the analyses. Together, these tabs generate the building blocks for outlining the specific contrasts or impact analyses that you will enter in tab 5. There are links across all of the tabs. So information from earlier tabs is automatically pre-populated into later tabs. This makes completion of the contrast tool more efficient and more systematic. It also means that completing the contrast tool tabs in numerical order will take advantage of that pre-population. I think I may have, there's some noise there. I think I may have lost control of the slides. I want to advance to the next slide. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the second set of tabs, tabs 6 through 8A, are for reporting the results for each of the contrasts or impact analyses. The reporting tabs will automatically be pre-populated with the list of contrasts that you entered in tab 5 and allow you to enter key statistics from the analyses for each contrast as relevant for your design. So there are tabs for impact, reporting impact estimates, information about the representativeness of the sample at post-test. I think Cambridge, I think I still do not have control. Oh, maybe I do. Sorry, everybody. Okay, sorry. There's a tab for reporting attrition, baseline equivalence, and representativeness of the sample at baseline. Next, Barbara is going to talk about how to use the contrast tool to plan analyses. Okay, so while they work out their audio issue or whatever is going on there, I will just get you started on and say that the next set of slides that we're going to review are focused on describing the study design and analysis plan. For each tab, we're going to go through an example of what it looks like when the information has been entered into the tab, and so that you can see how they're used. So we're going to, in showing you how to use the contrast tool tabs for planning your study, we're going to focus on one example study. I'm going to give you some details about that study, and then we'll show you how to use the contrast tool for always focusing on that same example. So in this hypothetical study, there's an intervention that's a 2-semester intervention called the New Student Seminar, which is designed for entering college freshmen beginning in school year 2015-2016. And there are 2 additional cohorts of students that will be included in the intervention. Okay, the design is a multi-site student RCT, so within each institution, students are assigned to either participate in the New Student Seminar or the business as usual course taking. The sample includes 10 colleges with 40 freshmen per college in each cohort, 20 treatment and 20 comparison students per college. The outcomes that are examined in this evaluation are credit accumulation and student self-confidence at the end of the freshman year and at the end of the sophomore, which is the end of the intervention, and then at the end of the sophomore year, 1 year later after the intervention's ended. The measures that are used to establish baseline equivalence in the case of high attrition, because this is an RCT, are high school GPA, which is a measure of academic achievement, and Pell Grant eligibility, which is a measure of SES, and then also for the analyses looking at impacts on student self-confidence, there's a baseline measure of student self-confidence from the beginning of the freshman year. Okay.
Thank you, Anne. I can take it from here.
Great.
Okay. So we're going to start with the first tab in the contrast tool, which is the tab where you enter your research questions. This is what the tab looks like when you open it up and there's nothing in it yet, and it gives you just an open space to write all of the research questions for your impact study. Any question here will automatically be entered into a drop-down menu that you'll be able to access when you're on the final tab and specifying your analyses in order to link them to the appropriate research question. As you know from having design studies, clearly defining what your guiding research questions are an important first step. And this is a good place to list them and be clear going forward what are all the elements you're going to need to actually address that research question. On this tab for research questions, we recommend entering information about the name of the intervention and the comparison conditions, the outcome domain and measure, the timing of the outcome measurement, the age and grade of the individuals or participants at the time of the outcome measurement, and the length of exposure at the time of the outcome measurement. Also, if it's a study that has multiple cohorts, we recommend that also as part of the research question. So for our hypothetical example, here are 3 research questions that might be asked. We're going to focus on the first research question as an example and walk through it. So the first thing in this research question is, what is the name of the intervention? So it's, do college students who participated in the new, in the new student seminar, so there you see the name of the intervention. Next you see in the same research question the name of the counterfactual condition, business as usual, student supports. It indicates when the outcome is measured, end of the freshman year, indicates how long the intervention lasted, which was 2 semesters for freshmen. It indicates that there are 3 cohorts of entering freshmen in this analysis question, those who entered in fall 15, 16, and 17. It indicates what the outcome is, which is credit accumulation, outcome domain, and the actual outcome is number of credits. And so all in all, when you read the research question, it's fairly wordy, but it actually specifies all of the pieces that will help you understand what the analysis, sample, and contrast will look like. Again, do college students who participated in the new student services, for 2 semesters as freshmen in fall 15, 16, or 17 have greater credit accumulation as measured by number of credits earned at the end of their freshman year compared to college students who received business as usual student support during their freshman year. So remember this question, because when we get to the end, you'll see how we have built up all the pieces to specify the analysis that addresses that question. Once you can specify all your research questions, you can go on to tab 2, which is where you specify the outcome measures for which the impacts are being assessed. And those should be outcome measures that have been referenced in the full set of research questions. This is what a blank tab 2 looks like when you open it up. And it tells you all the information you're going to want to know about outcomes. The name of the outcome domain that you have assigned it to, the name of the measure, a reference if it's needed, whether it is a normed or state test or standard educational indicator. If you need to specify whether the measure meets the WWC face validity standard, reliability standard, or the standards for being not over-aligned and consistently collected. The shaded parts on this blank template are where the contrast tool automatically generates a yes-no judgment. And so when we show the actual example, you will see how this works. Again, here's a list of all of the elements you're going to want to enter on that tab for you to reference when you actually do this yourself. But let's take a look at let me say one more thing. If you remember the WWC standards, they actually set minimum thresholds for what, depending on the type of reliability. And those are built into the contrast tool so that when you actually enter a reliability statistic, the tool generates an assessment of yes, no, does that meet the WWC specified minimum for that type of reliability. And at the end of this, the tab will automatically provide a yes-no informal assessment of whether the measure has the potential to meet all 4 WWC standards. We know this is important because if you conduct a perfectly designed study and a well-done analysis, but you're using a measure that does not meet the outcome standards, that analysis will not be able to meet WWC standards. So it's important to know in advance whether you have picked measures that can be justified or given evidence that they will meet the standards. And the one thing the WWC allows is if your measure is from a standardized test or a state test or a standard behavior or educational outcome such as GPA or graduation or enrollment, you do not need to further provide evidence of the psychometric properties of that measure in order for it to meet standards. We ask you in our tab, and the WWC will find it important to identify the domain for each outcome. And the reason it's important is the WWC applies multiple comparison adjustments when the study tests multiple outcomes in the same domain. And so when you assign a domain to your outcome, we recommend that you assign domains that are consistent with the WWC assigned domain to help you predict and know in advance how the WWC is likely to apply multiple comparison adjustments to findings for those outcomes. And the tip box on this slide alerts you to the fact that the WWC review protocols may give you information about how the WWC thinks of domains for particular intervention areas and how they assign outcomes to domains. So it's a good idea for you to go to the relevant WWC topic review protocol to understand what your outcome, what thresholds your outcome would need to meet in order to be considered meeting all of the outcome standards. So now let's look at our hypothetical study example. And if you note, there are two key outcomes: the number of credits earned and student self-perception. The student self-perception of themselves as a student. And if you'll note, the outcome domain being assigned, which is actually specified in the topic review guide for post-secondary intervention studies. For number of credits earned, the outcome domain is credit accumulation. And for the student self-confidence, you're going to assign an outcome domain. This is not addressed in probably any particular topic review guide, and so you're going to assign a domain, and you won't really be able to know in advance exactly how the WWC will assign it, but it's very unlikely in the case of this study that they would consider those two outcomes in the same domain, and therefore you would not need to worry about a multiple comparison adjustment. So you notice that for credit accumulation, it is assessed to be a standard educational indicator. So by putting yes there, it automatically has the potential to meet WWC outcome criteria. You don't have to enter anything else. That's different than for the self-confidence measure, where you have no for whether it's a normed or state test or educational indicator, indicating you're going to need to provide the information for the WWC evidence reviewer to know whether this outcome meets standards. So you're going to make an assessment of whether you think this measure meets face validity standards. That is it measuring what it purports to measure? And when it's a measure that is not a standardized or well-known measure, it is often helpful to attach that measure to a report so that a reviewer can actually look at what's asked in order to make this assessment. You are going to enter what you know about from prior studies about the reliability of that measure. In this case, we're saying that from a prior study, it was reported, Chromax alpha was reported, a measure of internal consistency of 0.62. Now, the sheet automatically generates yes because that meets the minimum threshold that WWC has set for that type of reliability. You also are going to answer whether it was over-aligned with the intervention. In this case, you have determined that there is not a reason to think that the students who are in the intervention condition would get a higher score on this measure because they were in the intervention than the students in the comparison condition. So you assess that it is not over-aligned, and because all of the students were given the measure at the same time after they are determined to be eligible, interested in the study, and before they are assigned, everyone is given the survey, you can say, yes, this was consistently collected in both conditions. As a result, in the shaded box, automatically a yes will appear because this measure, in your own sort of informal review of it, meets all of the WWC outcome standards. So you will do this for all of the outcomes that are referenced in the prior tab on your research questions. And what it gives you is a nice way to understand that you are going to have trouble with one of your outcomes and meeting standards. And it's possible, as we know, that you don't have any reliability statistics till after your study is over, because you're going to use your own study sample to produce that reliability estimate. In that case, you will not be able to say, yes, I know that this study has the possibility of the likelihood of meeting standards, and this will come up as a no at this point, because you won't be able to enter any actual reliability statistic. So that's your second tab. The third tab is where you specify the measures you're going to use to establish the equivalence of the treatment and comparison samples at baseline. Note, even though this tab is called baseline measures, we are really considering it the place where you list and describe only the measures that are required to establish baseline equivalent, not all of your potential covariates that you might use that are not really part of that equivalence evidence. The blank tab looks very similar to the outcome measures tab, because basically baseline measures need to meet the same standards as outcome measures, so you're going to actually go through the same process of looking at the validity, reliability, and consistency of data collection of any of the measures you're going to use to establish baseline equivalence. So all of the same elements are on this tab. And again, we provide a list for you of all of the pieces of information you need to know to complete the tab. And we're going to walk through it now with an example from our hypothetical study. Note that overalignment is the one difference, that overalignment is not a relevant concept for baseline measures, because you're asking about overalignment with an intervention that hasn't happened yet, so it's a little hard to consider that would be overaligned in terms of the treatment group answering this in a way systematically differently than the control group. So there really are only 3 outcome standards you're worrying about for your baseline measures. There are 2 new types of information that are specific to baseline measures, and that is the type of scale being used and the type of score that is being used when you measure your baseline outcome. The reason these are important is it may matter in terms of how you actually test the difference between the treatment and control group on the baseline measure, depending on what the form of the score is. So these are new columns that do not appear on the outcome measure page. So here we are back to our hypothetical study and what a tab might look like. So if you remember, we had 2 outcomes on our outcome page. The first one was credit accumulation. And as we know, there is not a natural baseline for that outcome at the time students have started college. They haven't accumulated any credits yet. So when you go look at the WWC review protocol for post-secondary intervention, it says if you don't have a natural baseline, we want you to be able to establish equivalence on a continuous measure of academic achievement and a measure of socioeconomic status. Therefore, you see both of those measures are on the list of your baseline measures. For the measure of student self-confidence, the survey, since you are giving the survey before they start the intervention and after, there is a natural baseline, and that very same measure will be the baseline. So as we walk through this, you can see for the academic achievement and socioeconomic status, you don't need a reference. They are normed state tests or educational indicators, and they automatically have a yes entered in the last column 15 about meeting standards. For the baseline measure, again, you're going to say it meets validity standards. You're going to use the same measure of internal consistency you showed on the outcome measure, and you're going to say it was consistently collected. So as a baseline measure, this measure also meets the, you've informally assessed that it meets the WWC outcome standards. In this case, all 3 of these measures you're going to tell us what is the scale of the measure and what is the form of the measure. So for high school GPA, it's on a continuous scale, and it is going to be a raw score. For the Pell Grant eligibility, it's a binary measure also that you will have yes or no eligible. And for the student self-perception questionnaire, since you won't know it, I can tell you, it's also on a continuous scale, and it'll be a raw score. So basically, what tabs 2 and tab 3 are very similar. Again, the important thing is that you know in advance that you're proposing to use measures that have the probability of meeting WWC outcome standards. Both of these tabs automatically generate drop-down menus that you will see again when you get to your contrast at the end, and they say, what is your outcome, what is your baseline measure? You no longer have to enter that anew. All you're going to have is a drop-down menu that has been populated from these prior tabs. So the next tab is tab 4, and this is where it's going to take a little more of your thinking to put this tab together, because here is where you actually have to start to specify exactly which parts or members of your treatment and comparison groups are going to be used in each of your contrasts to answer each of your research questions. We know that particularly in complex studies where you have multiple time points and multiple kinds of exposure you want to look at, you're going to be drawing on different segments of your sample that is building up over time. And we have found that one of the discussions that we need to have ourselves, as do any evaluator, is exactly how to characterize the sample that is going to best allow you to test a particular research question. And so this tab is actually one of the really most important tabs that you can plan out in advance. As you know, you're going to be referring back to your research questions when you think about these samples, and you're also going to be sort of looking ahead to the actual analyses to know exactly what samples you're going to need. So this is a pivotal point in the contrast tool. So when you look at what the blank sample tab looks like, it actually, I'm just going to show you, extends. We can't even fit it on one page. It extends over actually 23 columns. So there are many different pieces of information that this tab is asking you to put into the shell in order to truly define what a sample looks like. It is calling on you to both talk about who's in the sample, at what point that sample is being defined, and for that sample, what is the length of the exposure, the age of the students, and the cohorts that are involved for that particular sample. And all of these are referencing both back to the research questions and ahead to the specific analysis. So when we look at the list of information, you can see that, as I said, you're going to indicate whether the sample is a treatment or comparison sample, how long the intervention has been implemented at the time of the outcome, the unit of measurement, the age and grade of participants, whether you're talking about a subgroup like only the high-achieving students or the low-achieving students or only the first-time college, kids who are in the college for the first time versus including both transfers and returning students, or the full sample of students, the number of cohorts that are being included in the sample, the length of time they had been exposed to the intervention at the time of the outcome measurement, the timing of the outcome measurement, and again, this may be different for different cohorts, the size of the sample, and then how the units were formed. Were they randomly assigned or were they assigned non-randomly? And if they were assigned in a cluster, whether the sample includes early or late joiners, which, as you know, is a concept specific to WWC about whether your sample includes students who joined after randomization occurred. So in order to really understand what all this looks like, let's look at an actual example from our hypothetical study. And again, if you we didn't have time to go over all the research questions, but as you remember, the overall design is to look at the 2 outcomes of interest at 2 time points. At the end of the intervention, that is the end of freshman year for each cohort, and then a year later at the end of the sophomore year for each cohort. So here's what you do on a sample tab. You get to give it a name that helps you remember what it is. In this case, I gave treatment group end of intervention. Again, this is totally up to you, whatever the acronym that syncs back to your brain. It's good to put something there that has some meaning because these will, again, appear on the contrast page as a drop-down menu. And again, you put treatment and comparison samples on separate rows, even though they're part of the same contrast. So then there's your second treatment sample, which is treatment. It's a follow-up sample 2 semesters later. So again, these are not given acronyms. You can use whatever you want, and they could even just be a number. But we have found over time that giving some clue to what the sample is usually helpful. Again, using a drop-down member, say, is this a T or a C sample? Then you're also going to talk about what is the name of the condition that goes with that sample. So for a treatment sample, it's going to be NSS, or our new student supports. For our control samples, it's going to be business as usual. Once you enter these data, the nice thing is they're going to carry over into your contrast tab. Will make it easier for you to specify your actual analyses. The next thing that you would say is the length of intervention at the time of the outcome measurement. That is, how long has the intervention been going on? So for your first cohort, when you're measuring, again, all 3 cohorts, the first cohort, the intervention will have been in place for 2 semesters. In your second cohort, the intervention will have been going on for 4 semesters. And in your third cohort, it will be going on for 6 semesters. This is telling you really the maturity of the intervention for each cohort. So for the first cohort of kids, they're getting the first trial of the intervention, the first 2 semesters that's ever been implemented. For the second cohort, the implementation, for all you know, may be getting better because now they've had 1 year under their belt and they're doing it for a second time, and for the third cohort, even longer. And so this is just a clue for you that when you put these 3 cohorts together, you're really assessing the effect of an intervention that has been going on anywhere from 2 to 6 semesters. The unit being measured in our study is always the student, as you remember. This is a student random assignment study. Even though they're always within institutions, the measurement is always at the student level. For the cohorts that are at the end of intervention, is it always at the end of the freshman year for every cohort. For the contrasts that have to do with the sophomore year follow-up, it's at the end of their sophomore year. Again, they're always in post-secondary, so that's easy enough. And there are always 3 cohorts. And again, it's important to put the dates in here so you're understanding when the measurement is. So in all of these, there are 3 cohorts of entering freshmen in 15, 16, or 17. Every cohort is getting 2 semesters of intervention, regardless of when they get the intervention. So column 10 is asking about the length of exposure to the condition for those specific units being measured. Then it's telling us when are we actually measuring the outcome. And this is saying for each cohort, it's a different time. It's spring of 16, spring of 17, spring of 18. So these, actually drawing yourself a little picture and understanding when you're measuring everyone is very important because we often ourselves aren't clear if we wait until the very end to start to do the analyses and haven't really laid out for ourselves a plan of who's going to be pulled into this analysis. So that's the first 11 columns of the tab. Then for the follow-up outcomes, they're going to be measured a year later for each cohort. So for cohort 1, it's spring 17, cohort 2, spring 18, cohort 3, spring 19. One of the reasons to do this is we've often found when you get a grant that has a very specified end date, you often realize you've now gone beyond the end date of your grant to try and follow up all 3 of your cohorts into the final measurement. So this is a very illuminating exercise we have found for all of us doing studies. So when you move to the second page, the second set of columns from 12 to 21, first, you're putting in here an estimate of the sample size. This is just an estimate because this is as planned as opposed to what really happens. But as you remember, we had 10 institutions, and every time each institution had 40 students. So it's 1,200 kids total divided across treatment and control. And we suspect by the time you get to the follow-up, those are not going to be 600 students necessarily left. But this is sort of your estimated, your best sample estimate. In our case, we know they were randomly assigned, so yes is picked for all 4 of these. And it was not a cluster random assignment, so that's NA for the rest. And if you've done a QED, you could also talk about the unit of assignment there. So your sample tab can often have 20 or 30 different samples depending on how complex your research questions are about subsamples, time of exposure, time that the intervention's been going on, length of exposure. So this is an idea of a fairly simple study and that you still need 4 samples. So now we're going to go to tab 5, which is really the heart of the tool. It's sort of like the family name. It's named the contrast tool, and tab 5 is the contrast tab. And what you've been doing is building up all of the, as Ann said, all of the building blocks to complete tab 5, because here's where you're actually putting down an analysis plan in fairly high level of detail that will help you understand when you finally get your data in what analyses you're going to run with whom. And so this is really, as we say, the heart of the contrast tool. And when you look at the actual blank template for this, you can see that, again, there's some shading. The shading is always suggesting to you that this is something that will automatically be filled in by the tab. So it's pulling from other pieces that you've already entered. And again, you're being asked, first of all, to say, this is now a row where you have 2 samples. You have your treatment and your comparison samples. So you're going to pick from the list you've made on the prior tab which 2 samples are being compared for a particular analysis. Here's where you're actually talking about the type of scale and score for the outcome measurement, whether you have any plans for imputing outcome data, and whether, if you need to establish baseline equivalence, how many measures you're going to use to establish it. Second, you would actually indicate which measures you're going to use, and if you say you have 2 measures, these same tabs from 8 to 12 repeat 3 times. So you can have up to 3 measures for establishing baseline equivalence. So you would actually put in a measure, and again, what the unit of observation is, and the grade of the student at the time of the baseline measurement, the timing, and whether you have any plans for imputing baseline data. And finally, you're going to link each row of the contrast tool to one of your research questions. Again, here's the list of all the information that you're going to need to complete the tab as a sort of checklist for you. But let's go to an example of a completed, at least part of a completed contrast tool for our hypothetical study, because I think it becomes a little clearer. So in this tab, you actually have 4 contrasts, 2 within each of the outcomes. And so the way the contrast tool works is they nest all of the analyses within an outcome and a domain. So the first gray row says there's our credit accumulation domain with the number of credits earned. That pulls in automatically from your outcome list. And your second gray bar is measuring student self-confidence using the Clark Student Self-Perception Questionnaire. And within each of those gray bars, you'll note there are 2 contrasts. One represents the immediate end of intervention contrast, and the second one represents the follow-up contrast at the end of 2 semesters after the intervention. So as you can see, this tab 5 is highly organized for you. It's making you work in an organized way through all of the analyses you want to do for each of your outcomes. So again, there you see 2 contrasts for each of our outcomes. And in this first row, you are using this row to specify the end of intervention contrast, the end of intervention analysis of the effect on number of credits earned. So from a drop-down menu, you're going to pick that old acronym we asked you to give so you understood it. That's treatment at the end of intervention, and it will automatically pull in the name that you have put before, NSS, our new student supports. You're going to pick the control end of treatment. The tool will automatically pull in business as usual. And the same for the follow-up analysis at the end of sophomore year. And again, the same thing repeats for the next set of contrasts. Again, because this is credits earned, it's continuous, it's a raw score, and so you will enter that in. And you will do whether or not you have any plans for imputing outcome data, just to make it easy for you. We're saying we don't have any plans, and it is an RCT, so it is relevant. And as you remember, we may not need to establish baseline equivalence because it's an RCT and there may be low attrition, but we have protected ourselves by knowing that we have data to measure baseline equivalence on the 2 required measures. That's what that 2 is there. Then you can see when you keep going on the tab, there's measure 1 and measure 2. So for the credits earned, we're using high school GPA and Pell Grant eligibility. They're both measured at a student level. The high school GPA is measured at the end of high school. Pell Grant eligibility when the participants are entering freshmen. The high school outcome is measured in the spring before each cohort starts college, whereas Pell Grant eligibility is measured at the same time the student enters college. So you can see the 3 dates for each cohort. And again, we're not imputing any data. And as you note, here's a drop-down menu, and we didn't leave enough space to enter that long research question, but it ties you back, gives you a drop-down menu. What is the actual research question that this contrast is measuring? So when you've completed this page, you have actually set out an analysis plan for yourself. It doesn't tell you what the methodology is, whether you're going to use regression or a logit analysis, but it does tell you the important parts about what the sample is that you are going to use to answer that particular research question. And by making yourself do this, it actually gives you quite a bit of helpful discipline in advance to make sure that you have the right samples to answer the question as you wish. And so that is, when you finish tab 5, you're sort of done until you get your data and actually analyze the data and get ready to report it. And this is what Anne is now going to pick up the story after tab 5 and move into the reporting tabs. And for some of you, this is exactly where you are in the schedule of your evaluation. So I think these may be even more interesting to you. So I'm handing the controls back to Anne.
Okay, I think I have the controls, and hopefully everybody can hear me now. So as Barbara said, now we're going to review the tabs in the contrast tool that can be used to gather the information needed for reporting findings. That's tabs 6 through 8A. I'm going to describe what each tab is used for, show what it looks like, and go over the information to be provided on the tab using an example for how to complete it. Oops. I had control, but now I seem to have lost it. Okay, there we go. All right, tab 6 is used for reporting the impacts for each contrast. When you complete the tab, you'll have all the data that you need to create exhibits about intervention impacts for reports, journal articles, or other publications about the intervention effects. Okay, so this is what tab 6 looks like before you complete it. it, like all of the reporting tabs, follows the same format and organization as tab 5. So it has one row for each contrast, and also the information in all the reporting tabs, the information about each contrast that you entered in tab 5 will automatically appear in each one of these reporting tabs. And then there'll just be additional columns on the right so that you're able to enter the relevant information for each contrast on that tab, and in this case for entering the results from the impact analyses. Okay. This slide lists all the information that you need to provide on tab 6, but instead of reading through the list, I'm just going to walk you through the completed tab. I don't know if I'm advancing it or not, but this is the right slide. So this example shows what the tab looks like when the results of the impact analysis are entered. And I want to just add that, like, for these reporting tabs, we're no longer following that same example design scenario that Barbara was carrying through tabs 1 to 5. So we, changed some things up a little bit to illustrate some different kinds of designs, because this tab 6 with impact analyses, is appropriate for all of the designs, but some of them apply only to some designs that you might have. So in this example, the results are from the statistical analysis of impacts for 2 different outcomes. College GPA and college persistence. The study in this case is a cluster design, so data are entered on the tab for the sample sizes for the number of clusters included in the analysis and the number of students included in the analysis. There's also a place to enter the standard deviations on the outcome measure for the treatment group and for the comparison group. And this is a little tricky concept. There's a drop-down menu also there where you can select the source of the standard deviation, which in most cases, and in this example, it's just the standard deviation is calculated for the analytic sample, but sometimes people use other sources for the standard deviation, like a published standard deviation, maybe in the state for a state test or that sort of thing. So the next column is the place where you enter the comparison group mean, and that's just the unadjusted sample mean for the comparison group. Then you enter the impact estimate from your analyses. This is the coefficient on the treatment variable in your impact analysis. And then the other results from the analysis that you want to enter are the standard error for the impact estimate, the degrees of freedom, and the exact p-value from your two-tailed test of the treatment effect. In addition, you can enter the standardized effect size. The standardized effect size, which is the impact divided by the pooled standard deviation. But regardless of whether you provide that standardized effect size or not, all the rest of the information here in this row is sufficient for the WWC to be able to calculate it. So whether you do or don't provide it, the WWC will calculate the standardized effect size. Okay. Tab 6 is relevant for some cluster design studies. Some, but not all, cluster assignment studies have to provide evidence of representativeness. Representativeness is a measure of non-response. It's a measure of the percentage of individuals enrolled in clusters who do not contribute to the data, do not contribute any data to the analysis. So the WWC, it's kind of a concept similar to attrition that applies in some cluster design studies. And the WWC assesses representativeness using those same attrition boundaries that they use for measuring attrition in RCTs. I'm not going to go into detail about when cluster studies need to report representativeness, and just point you to the WWC Standards Handbook, which is available on the WWC website for more information about that. But I will, just show you what kind of information would need to be entered if this is something you need to report for your study. This slide shows what tab 6 looks like. Like all of the reporting tabs, there's one row for each contrast from tab 5, and then there are additional columns for entering the necessary sample size information to calculate representativeness. So you enter information in the unshaded cells, and then the representativeness rates are automatically calculated in the shaded cells. This slide lists all the information that you need to complete tab 6A, but I'm going to go through it with the example tab, the completed example. So in the example here, representativeness at post-test is calculated for 2 contrasts. For each contrast, for the treatment group and for the comparison group, actually the analytic sample sizes are automatically pre-populated from tab 6. So remember that when you completed tab 6 with your impact analysis results, you entered the analytic sample size information. And so that automatically appears here, the number of treatment and comparison clusters at post-test in the analysis, and the number of treatment and comparison individuals contributing to the mean for those post-test, those means at post-test for the clusters. Then you need to enter the number of treatment and comparison individuals enrolled in the clusters at the time of post-test, the timing when post-test was measured, and the timing of when enrollment was measured. And these dates should be fairly closely aligned so that you're measuring representativeness at the time when you're measuring post-test. So based on this sample size information, the representativeness rates are automatically calculated. In this example, for the first contrast, representativeness in the treatment group, or really non-response at post-test, is 12%. For the comparison clusters, it's 16%. The differential rate between the two groups is 4 percentage points, and the overall rate is, for the full sample, is 14%. Okay, tab 7 is used for reporting sample sizes at the individual and cluster levels for the purpose of calculating attrition. This is what tab 7 looks like before you enter information. Like all the reporting tabs, it has one row for each contrast, and then additional columns for reporting the necessary sample size information to calculate attrition. I want to point out that there are a set of columns for reporting cluster sample sizes, which are shown here. And there are also a parallel set of columns for reporting individual sample sizes. So for a cluster RCT, you would be completing both sets of columns. These columns about the cluster sample size, as well as the ones about the student sample size. For a student RCT, you would just complete the columns focused on the individual sample sizes. You enter sample sizes in the unshaded cells, and then attrition rates are automatically calculated in the shaded cells. This slide lists all the information that you need to complete tab 7, but again, I'm going to go through that on the completed example. So here, the information for clusters is completed. You need to enter the number of clusters that were randomized to each condition, and then the number of clusters in the analytic sample will be pre-populated from the information you entered in tab 6. In this example, in the first contrast, 2 treatment clusters were lost and 1 comparison cluster was lost. Based on these sample size numbers, the tab automatically calculates the different forms of cluster attrition: attrition in the treatment group, in the comparison group, and the differential cluster attrition rate, and the overall cluster attrition rate. And then in the second contrast, none of the clusters were lost, so the attrition rate is 0. Okay. Then, as I mentioned, there are additional columns on tab 7 for reporting information about the student sample sizes in the unshaded cells, and then student attrition rates are calculated in the shaded cells. Again, so the information you're going to report for students is essentially the same as the information you'd report about cluster sample sizes, and those are entered in the example tab. And I'm not even going to go through the list because it's really the same information that we just talked about, and I want to make sure that we get to everything. The one thing I will add is just that I want to remind you, if you're entering sample size information about students in a cluster design, you want to remember only to count the students in non-attrited clusters. So when you're reporting the number of students who are randomized, only report the number randomized from non-attrited clusters. Okay, the next tab is tab 8 on baseline equivalence. And this is required for QEDs and RCTs with high attrition, and also for RCTs that have bias from entering individuals. Here's an example of what the tab looks like, with a row for each contrast and columns for entering necessary information about baseline equivalence. This tab, tab 8, is really almost the same as tab 6, where you reported information about impacts, but instead of focusing on the outcome time point, post-test, this tab is focused on the difference between the groups at baseline. Again, the information you're going to enter is very similar to what you entered on tab 6, and I will take you through the example carefully, because this is important for lots of designs. So the information, as I mentioned, it's similar to the information on tab 6. Results are entered, in this example, results are entered for tests of baseline equivalence on a single baseline measure for each of 3 different contrasts that are shown here. But the tab, as Barbara mentioned earlier, when entering information on baseline measures, you can have up to 3 baseline measures for each contrast, and this tab will allow you to report information about baseline equivalence for up to 3 measures for each contrast. But I'm just showing you one for each contrast here so it fits on the screen. So the name of the baseline measure is selected from a drop-down menu, which is automatically populated with the list of baseline measures that you entered earlier on tab 3. Then for each contrast, you need to enter information on the sample size in the analytic sample for the treatment group and the comparison group. This is not pre-populated, but you should be alert to the fact that these sample size numbers, when you're assessing baseline equivalence, they should be the same numbers that you're reporting in your analytic sample for impacts. So check that. Then you also need to enter the standard deviation for each condition for the baseline measure. The source of the standard deviation, as we discussed before, it's a drop-down menu. Usually you'll be choosing that it was calculated from the sample. Then you'll enter the comparison group mean for the baseline measure. This is just the unadjusted sample mean for the comparison group. The difference between the means, the baseline means for the treatment group and the comparison group, as well as the method that you used to calculate the treatment and comparison difference. There's a drop-down menu where you can select the method that was used. That might be, you might use a model that has some features representing, that represent the design features in your evaluation, like blocking, for example. That's one approach you might use to calculate baseline differences, or you might just be comparing unadjusted means at baseline. So you can select that method you used from the drop-down menu. You can indicate on the tab whether the baseline measure is included as a control variable in the impact analysis for the contrast. And there's also a place to enter the standardized baseline difference. Okay, then tab 8A is the last tab. And earlier we discussed that some cluster assignment studies must provide evidence of representativeness at post-test. There also are some cluster assignment studies that need to provide evidence of representativeness at baseline. So this tab, tab 8A, can be used to provide the necessary sample size information to calculate representativeness at pretest. The tab looks just like tab 6, only the information is reported for baseline, about baseline sample sizes instead of at post-test. This is the same information is needed that you enter on tab 6A, and I can show you this in the example, completed tab. So in this example, representativeness at baseline is calculated for one contrast. There are 3 sample sizes that you need to enter for the treatment group and the comparison group. These are not pre-populated. You need to enter them yourself. The number of clusters at baseline in each condition, the number of students that contribute to the baseline mean for the clusters, and the number of treatment and comparison students that are enrolled in the clusters at baseline, as well as when baseline was measured and when enrollment was measured. And then from that information, the representativeness rates will be automatically calculated for each condition overall and the differential rate. And that's the last slide. Once you've completed all the reporting tabs that are relevant for your evaluation, you will have compiled all the findings that you need to include in your report or article. You'll be able to copy tables from the tool and you can include them in your publication. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, not advancing. Okay, so there. You can find some additional examples of completed contrast tools on IES's Evaluation Technical Assistance website. There are example evaluation plans for 3 different designs, a student-level RCT, a cluster-level RCT, and a QED. And in addition to the example evaluation plans, there are completed contrast tools for each of these examples. I will warn you that they're only completed for the planning tabs 1 to 5. None of the reporting tabs are completed. But these are some additional examples of how to use the contrast tool for planning your study design.